Okay, I hear you didn't sleep very well last night, and I think it might be a good idea if you had a nap, and so you can relax and go to sleep. And you can listen to my voice as I read the second chapter of the book that we started last week, The Will of Polyodla. So, let's begin. Davy loves Michaela. As Polly was considering this new discovery, wondering when exactly it had happened and how she'd never noticed before, Davy was walking across campus. He was still feeling a little sleepy and annoyed, anxious to keep a low profile around college. It bothered him that the lecturer had seen him leave, for it meant he'd have to give her classes a miss from now on. Paused at the gate, yawned, and wondered what to do. He thought about going back to check on his squat, but he was loath to. It was such a fine day, and anyway, Bartley, an old street cleaner, whose area included Cathedral View, had assured him that very morning that the terrace wouldn't be coming down for a while yet. Cathedral View was a terrace of derelict dwellings of near Playhouse Dimension, one of which Davy had made his home. Bartley, so told Davy, got his information on a good authority in City Hall, where he was well in with the top boys. Spotting Davy on the street in the mornings, he'd beckon him over, and grasping him by the arm, he'd look around conspiratorially, then whisper at him, "You're all right for a while. I'll give you the nod when the builders are due." Bartley had taken it upon himself to keep an eye out for the young fella, as he thought of Davy. Ever since Davy, coming across the old man in the pub one lunchtime, had stood him a pint, prompted by tiredness on the old man's kindly face as much as by the fact that Bartley happened to be standing beside him as he was ordering. And although Davy had long forgotten about the pint, Bartley hadn't. A few mornings ago, as Davy was going through his front door, literally crawling through a gap in his boarded-up front door, he thought he'd heard Bartley sweeping nearby, muttering, "Yes, sir, an officer and a gentleman." Davy imagined he must have been mistaken, or that he had said it as that he doubted it could be him the old man was referring to. His means of exit hardly befitted the manner of a gentleman, might be expected to leave his house of a morning. But Davy really didn't set too much store on Bartley's inside knowledge, suspecting that the old man had more idea than himself when the bulldozers were due to start clearing the way for the new road. No, Davy was more inclined to believe the New Age travellers squatting in another one of the cottages who heard that the terrace would be coming down before the end of the month. But it was such a fine day that in the end he decided to head to the bridge. In his pocket he had a copy of Kipling's Plain Tales from the Hills. It would be pleasant to sit in the crisp October sun and read, for the bridge would be quiet at this time of the day, being too early yet for most of the druggies and the drinkers who regularly congregated there to have stirred from their beds, and perhaps he'd catch a glimpse of her, the girl with the hair, as he thought of her, passing by on her way back from lunch. He walked on along College Street, along Abbey Street, across Gill Street, and around by Neilsburg Place. By Hot and Saucy, the takeaway, he turned into a cul-de-sac which served as an access to a few warehouses which ran along its length. These warehouses were underutilised now, and the dead-end stretch of road was used mainly for parking of the city's commuters and by its walkers on their way to the pedestrian bridge. At the point at which the road came to an abrupt end, the pedestrian bridge began, and, suspended elegantly by a simple steel curl, swooped up, then down. It crossed over the dual carriageway built along what was an old railway line some 40 feet below. The cul-de-sac itself was graffitied, littered area, but very quiet, except when the city's dropouts congregated to drink and deal, as they sometimes did. Now Davy stopped just short of the pedestrian bridge and climbed to the top of a flight of steps, which led to a disused door at the back of the hospital. And he sat down at the top step. This was his favourite spot in all of the city, high over it with a bird's eye view from where he'd come to know Cork City as well as any Corkonian. On a clear day like today, you could see right across the city. You could see the tops of various historic buildings, Callanan's Tower, the Red Abbey, Elizabeth Fort, and you could see the spires of the churches, and there were many, St. Nicholas's, St. Vincent's, St. Finbarr's, St. Patrick's. A cautious lot, these people of Cork, Davy often thought, hedging their bets and honouring all and sundry, but still cute enough to put double money, as it were, on the inner circle. St. Mary's, Jesus' mother, St. Anne, his grandmother, St. Mary and St. Anne's mother and grandmother, St. Peter, his best friend, St. Peter and Paul, best friend and mother of the lad. From the step, Davy could trace the line of the city's quays and recognise the buildings which fronted onto the River Lee, or rather River Lee, for as the river came into the west of the city, it split into two, but merged again at the eastern edge, making an island of the city centre. A confusing geography for Davy when he first arrived, for being unaware of the dual river flow, he'd been constantly perplexed by finding the Lee in front of him, when he was certain he'd left it behind him. Beyond the city centre, he could see the north side, rising up steeply to the right, the rows and rows of fine old houses, 3 and 4 storied, brightly painted around St. Luke's and Montenotte, and to the left, the neat rows of corporation houses of Gurrana Braher. Both the posh and not so posh north side residents all looked down on the city centre, and their inhabitants were as familiar with its happenings as they were with the affairs of their own immediate neighbourhood. The last thing Davy could see before the land fell away onto the countryside was the water tower breaking its skyline at the city's edge. Sometimes sitting here on the steps, he'd spot an interesting building, one he'd never seen up close, and having plotted his route, he'd head off towards it. He loved walking around the city, particularly in the early morning or late at night or on the Sunday times, when the city shoppers and commuters had gone back to wherever it was they came from and left the city to its inhabitants. Sometimes en route, he'd encounter a person, and something about them would cause them to temporarily abandon the building and to follow them instead. He supposed it was weird to follow strangers, and although he never really thought why he did it, there were several reasons: boredom, plain nosiness, loneliness. 2 types of people intrigued him enough to trail: odd people, those with mismatching runners or solitary mumblings, and beautiful women with just something about them. In her case, it was her hair. It was soon after he had arrived in Cork, and he'd been walking towards a bright blue building high up on Patrick's Hill, when he'd first noticed her. He caught a glimpse of her hair, first when she was still in the distance, and as she came towards him, he watched the sunlight play on it, its various colours, picking up one then another, and there were many: gold, copper, red, mahogany, and lots of others which he couldn't name in that mass of tumbling autumn. As she came closer, he studied her face, a beautiful elfin-shaped face, with light clear green eyes and lips which hinted at a smile and promised laughter. Most people, Davy noticed, had a gloomy, vacant set to their face when they walked alone. Who knows what they were thinking, if they were thinking at all, but she was different, and Davy was fascinated to watch her expression, which changed by the second as she came towards him, as if she was carrying on the most animated and contrary conversation in her head. As she passed him, he caught the delicate scent of her perfume, and heard her softly hum to herself. As he turned around and followed her, the route she took was the very one he had come from, and she brought him back to where he'd set out, then past the hospital steps and on over the pedestrian bridge to the other side, to a yellow house in the middle terrace, leading up from the bridge. Since he'd seen her walking by many times as he sat on the steps, and he'd come to notice that she was as regular as clockwork: 1:05, home to a yellow house; 1:55, back to work; 5:35, home again. Occasionally he'd get an unexpected bonus sighting. Once, passing a coffee shop on Washington Street, he glanced in through the window and saw her sitting there, head bent over a newspaper. He stopped, pretending to study the menu, and watched her for a few moments. Then she looked up, stared straight at him, and her face broke into the most wonderful smile. He smiled back. But then she picked up her pen to scribble in whatever crossword clue she'd managed to solve, and which had pleased her, and he realised it wasn't him she was smiling at. Another time, seeing her going into H&B, he followed her inside and watched her for ages as she flicked through the rows of CDs, until finally she selected one and carried it around while she continued to browse. Then he watched as she stood in the centre of the shop, contemplating the CD in her hand. Would she, wouldn't she? Finally she shook her head, dumped the CD, and walked quickly out. He went to the door, searched the crowd for the mass of hair, where she disappeared into the crowd of shoppers. He'd gone back inside, found the CD where she put it, and bought it. Although he didn't really have the money to spend on it, he never heard of the singer Nick Cave, and he didn't even have a CD player on which to listen to it. Davy's timepieces were the city's clock. Now he couldn't see any, but thought it must be nearly 2, and figured it was too late. But she wouldn't be passing by today. He saw a group of men coming up the road and recognized them as regular bridge drinkers. As the professor shouted one, "All right," Davy called, and watched them settle down, some on the bonnet of his parked car, others in a row along the footpath, each with his flagon of cider or a couple of cans. One had a bull terrier with him, another a little girl, equally dirty and neglected looking, and left to amuse themselves as the drinking commenced. When Davy first started coming to the bridge, these fellows had given him hassle, mocked him for his book and that he always had with him, and for his northern accent. But he'd known tougher types indeed. His father and his brother Stephen, for instance, not to mention his mother. She'd have wiped the floor with them. They didn't intimidate Davy, and since he'd taken their jibes good-humouredly, they learned to leave him well enough alone. Once or twice, when he hadn't talked to anyone today, and they hadn't yet drunk themselves into a stupor, he'd even joined them for a while, and taken a can or bottle of cider they'd offered. And when they were on the serious batter, they'd touch him for a few bob, and he'd give it to them, if he had it on him. He hadn't made much of a start on Kipling. He tried to get stuck in, but was beginning to suspect that Kipling was an obnoxious old fart, and instead he began to watch the girl, sitting on the bottom step, playing. She was about 5, maybe 6, a little scrap of a thing, all knees and elbows, preliminarily dressed for October. She'd collected a whole load of beer bottles and cans, and had set them up in pairs on the step beside her. For the last 10 minutes she'd been talking quietly to them. Now it seemed that one bottle had displeased her, for suddenly she grabbed it up, held it out in front of her, and started wagging her finger at it crossly. "You're a very bold boy," Davy heard her scold. "If you don't have your homework done tomorrow, we'll be in very big trouble. Big trouble. Are you listening to me?" The beer bottle appeared to be rather a stubborn sort, and she was a very cross teacher. "Billy, if you don't answer me, I'll give you a walloping. I'll wring your bloody neck," she threatened. Davy laughed aloud, and she looked up at him, then stared at him suspiciously. Eventually she asked, "What's your name?" "Davy. What's yours?" "Eva," she answered, still staring at him. She began to consider the possibility of having a real-life student. "Would you like to be in my school?" she asked him. "I don't think so. You seem a bit cross." "Only to bold boys." She studied him again for a moment or two, then asked, "Are you a bold boy?" "No." "But you are a big boy." "Yes." She climbed up the step and stood before him, looking closely at his black curls. "Why have you got girl's hair?" she asked, and he shrugged. "So will you be in my school?" she asked again. Davy glanced over at the crowd of drinkers and saw her father watching. On those occasions when the other drinkers were flagging Davy off, this man had never joined in. He just sat apart, silently staring at Davy, his gorilla's body all coiled up with attention, and his palms permanently in fists, as if he were perpetually ready for a fight. Davy thought he'd only one expression, a nasty scowl, but now he realized he had a second, a viciously nasty scowl. He turned back to Eva. "I think I'm probably too big for your school. Anyway, I have to do my own homework," he said, indicating his book. "You'd better go back to your class. They would be wondering where you are." Her little face crumpled with disappointment. "Will you play with me the next day?" she asked. "We'll see." While Davy had been talking to Eva, the girl with the hair had passed by, and when he looked up he saw her hurrying down the street. He stared after her, disappointed to have missed her, seeing her face, but then she paused, and he watched as she rooted around in her handbag until she pulled out a Walkman, put it on, and continued walking, not realizing that her wallet had fallen out. "Hey!" he shouted, but she was out of earshot. He quickly got to his feet and ran down the steps, taking 2 at a time. "Ah, you knocked Billy over," moaned Eva. "Sorry, now there, Billy, you're fine again," said Davy, setting the bottle upright. and he ran down to where the wallet lay on the ground, picked it up and ran after the girl. "Hey!" he shouted. Michaela looked behind and seeing Davy running towards her, she began to panic. She was going to be attacked and there was no one around to help her. Certainly not those other fellows. They were probably his friends and they'd probably join in. As he got closer, she began to run, but not quick enough for almost immediately. She felt his hand on her shoulder. She yelled out. "Calm down, for God's sake," shouted Davy. "What do you want?" asked Michaela. "Your wallet? You... Here, take it." Michaela started searching in her bag. "No, you dropped it." He held out the wallet and she took it from him. "I'm sorry. I thought..." She stopped herself before she said it. "You thought I was going to rob you." "I'm really sorry. I was just a bit nervous." "Thanks. And don't worry, there's nothing missing." I didn't think there was." Davy left her standing there and began to walk back to the step. "Thanks," she shouted after him. He shrugged and continued walking. "Listen, hang on a second," she called. Davy turned around. "Can I give you something? You know, like a reward?" Immediately, Michaela saw by the look on his face that she'd said the wrong thing. "No thanks," he said. Okay, that was another chapter of the book. We will love Polly Odlum, and I hope that's helped make you a little sleepy and drowsy, and that you'll be able to get a nap now, and you'll wake up nice and refreshed. And the next day you have some trouble or you just want to bed to enjoy it, you can read another chapter. Until then, hope you sleep and see you again.